Today, we're going to talk about the science of perception, and things are going to get weird because there's this crazy conundrum with the brain, which is that it is stuck inside your body, inside a meat sack, and yet it itself, this center of consciousness, has no ability to sense anything on its own. If you were a brain surgeon, you cut off the top of someone's head and you poked their brain, the brain would feel absolutely nothing. And yet, it is this repository of a vibrant sensory experience of the world. So how does that happen? How do we understand the outside world in our brain, and how does that information move there? And how does that process explain a hell of a lot about what consciousness is all about? All right, this is going to get super weird, but it is incredibly fun and I think beneficial if you can sit through some a little bit complex descriptions. I'm not going to get too technical, but I will get a little technical here and there. So your brain stuck inside your body is connected to the outside world through nerves, through this peripheral nervous system. And your brain, again, it's in your skull, and you've got your spinal cord down here, and then going off the spinal cord are all of these little wires that are connected to various sensory apparatus. You have your eyes, you have your nose, your mouth for taste, smell, sight, heat. You have touch. You have the ability to detect how your body moves in space, and a few other things that you can detect. But your brain doesn't do any of that on its own. So let's say you're going to sense something for the very first time. Let's say you dump your hand into ice water. How does your brain know what that ice water is? Let's just say this is the first time you've ever touched ice water. You put your hand into this liquid, and your peripheral nervous system, your fingers, say, oh my God, we have a very strong sensation. At this point, that is just sensory data. And it goes up through your nerves, into the spinal cord, and up to the very base of the brain, to the lizard brain, they call it, which is the limbic system. Now, when it arrives in the limbic system, that data has no character at all. It has no actual meaning. It's just has a volume control on it. It is a loud signal. And your limbic system's job is to try to interpret what that signal actually means, to give it a character, to give it a flavor. And since you've never touched ice water before, a very unique thing happens. Now, I like to think metaphorically to talk about the limbic system as a library. And it is a library of every sense you've ever had in the past. And when this data comes into that library, the limbic librarian looks at that data, scans all of the books on the shelves and says, hey, we've never touched ice water before, and I don't know what to do with it. So the limbic librarian then kicks that sensory data over to a nearby structure. Actually, it's a series of structures called the Paralympic System. Now, the Paralympic System you can think of as a book bindery. And what it does, in order to make meaning of this brand new, just raw, meaningless data, that bookbinder takes the sensation and binds it with your current emotional state. This is hugely important. It is the root of consciousness. Your current emotional state is that it's bound sensory data to emotions and then it's kicked back down to the limbic librarian who says, hey, this ice water is the emotion of unmitigated horror, terror, and death. And now there's a reason why that is there, and we will get into this in another video about dreaming. Maybe you can just go link to it right here and go watch it. But this emotional state is bound to that sensory data, and the limbic librarian says, cool, and then you respond to that sensory data however you need to. This book is called a neural symbol, and it is the root of all consciousness. The binding of sensory data plus emotion is the bits and bytes of consciousness. Now, so you think of like a computer, you have these bits and bytes, which are just like pieces of information, ones and zeros put together in particular ways. And on their own, they don't mean anything. But when you have millions, billions, and trillions of bits and bytes, you can get computer videos. You can get the YouTube algorithm. You can get fully immersive virtual reality. And that's what the brain is doing. It is storing all of these neural symbols as bits and bytes. As you get more and more and more of them, you get human consciousness as we know it. Now, there's another part to this process which is hugely important. Let's say the second time you come to that bucket of ice water, you put your hand in that ice water, and the data list, just data information, comes into your brain, goes to the limbic librarian, and she looks at it, and she looks at all of the books on her shelves, and she says, hey, I already have a book for this. She takes it off the shelf and says, this book is unmitigated horror and terror, and therefore I don't need to kick it over into the bookbinder. I can now proceed with life on that way, which this is super meaningful because it means that you, if you're experiencing something for the second time, you are always living in your emotional past. This is the science of perception. This is actually how you perceive the world. It's sort of crazy to think that emotions are such a strong part of this. Now, there's some other things going on too, because perception is hugely complex. Another thing is that because I talked about the distance something moves, there's also time that it takes to get into the brain. On average, your nerves take about 1/5 of a second to move through the chemical and electrical pathways into your brain. This is problematic from a perspective of evolution, because normally if you were like a hunter-gatherer and you had a spear in your hand, you had to go hunt that tiger. If you were always 1/5 of a second behind true reality, your spear would miss that tiger. I don't know why you're hunting tigers, but apparently you are. That your spear would miss that tiger 100% of the time, which is very hard to survive. So the brain does this other fascinating thing in addition to neural symbols, is it creates an entire model of the world that you live in, stores it in the brain, and it overclocks it by 1/5 of a second by anticipating everything in the world around you, which means that your experience of reality is not, again, not true reality, but it's actually a construction created by your brain, which is sped up. And sometimes, and this is fascinating, sometimes it's wrong because its predictive efforts sometimes miss data, doesn't understand things, and that's where you get fascinating little bits of confusion. Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier is that in the neural symbol wiring situation is that where do emotions come from? Because if you're going to bind it with your emotional state, how does that happen? Well, this was a problem that I tackled in my book, The Wedge, because I was able to describe neural symbols after talking with Otto Music, who's a neuroscientist at Wayne State University, a guy named Andrew Huberman, who's a neuroscientist over at Stanford. And the emotional bit was not fully understood, at least by me at that time. It actually took me understanding dreams and the nature of dreams to understand that emotions form originally in dreams, and they're not what you think they are. Emotions are, in a way, they're a way to navigate the world. Like if let's say you want to cross the street, okay? And you look at the world, and that's just a sensory issue. You see a car coming, you don't want to get hit by the car, so you move out of the way. But you don't look at that data fresh every time. You see a car and you feel something. You think to yourself, I could get squished by that car. You're not thinking like Spock saying, okay, well, that car is moving at a predictable rate of movement. And if I move now, I will be able to cross the street, and otherwise I will get smooshed. But if I wait a little longer, I can wait till it passes, then I can go. That is not what you're thinking. You look at it, you have a feeling, car, hit, squish, and you choose to move or not move based on that. Emotions are actually how we navigate the world in general. They occur in dreams, and they're sort of connected to that simulacrum thing that happens in our brains where we're 1/5 of a second behind, and we have created this whole hologram of reality in there. During the day, you are getting tons of information all the time. It's just streaming into your brain. Like right now, I'm sitting here and I'm wearing a black shirt. You can perceive that. You're like, okay, yeah, he's in a black shirt. You do not need to remember that information in the future. It is completely useless information in your future, but your brain records it in the equivalent of RAM, which is the short-term memory in a computer. You have short-term memory in your brain, and you're collecting information that even stuff that you don't consciously remember, it's stuck in there until you sleep. And when you sleep, what the function of dreams is to take all of that data that you had from the day, the color of Scott's shirt, the quality of the light, the smell of that food you passed on the street, all of the things you did in the day, and it throws away the stuff you never need to think about again and condenses the rest of the information into a gist. That gist is like a zip file, and that gist is an emotion. That's where emotions are formed, and it happens in dreaming. So the science of perception, as you can see, and I've just given you the extremely fast version, it is incredibly complex because it deals with raw data, it deals with emotion, it deals with processing, and your prediction. All of that is happening in the brain so quickly that you can't perceive it. The other thing about perception, which is integral, is understanding that conception is also a vital part of this process. Now, perception means detecting data from the outside world, and conception goes from the inside to the outside world, like determining meaning and sort of figuring out how you want to conceive of the world. And the way we experience the world is a combination of both perception and conception. And when you really understand that, well, reality is really complex and hard to talk about and hard to think about because your conception of the world affects the way you perceive things because your emotions and your thoughts change the way the perceptions actually happen and wire into that limbic library. Well, I hope this was a extremely confusing primer for you on the science of perception and conception. If you want to know more, I wrote 2 books that are relevant here. One is The Wedge, which is all about consciousness and evolution and how you can use your power of conception to change the way your autonomic nervous system works. And the other is Dream, The Art and Science of Slumber, brand new book. And I really get deep into that question of what happens when you dream and how dreams form the way you perceive reality. Until next time, thanks so much from Magnetic North, currently in Mexico City.